"Your baby is fat, get him out of here," said the millionaire after mocking the cleaner's son. If this story interests you, subscribe to our channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. The sun had barely risen when Sarah woke up. That Monday, her tired eyes found little Ethan still sleeping, his round, serene face illuminated by the first light of day entering through the window of the simple room. At 6 years old, the boy was her whole life, her reason to smile even on the most difficult days. Sarah adjusted the blanket over him and kissed his forehead before starting her routine. In the small one-bedroom apartment in a suburban neighborhood of Chicago, she prepared for another day of work at Oakwood Estates, one of the most luxurious, gated communities in the city. As a cleaner, she had earned the trust of several residents over the past 3 years, mainly due to her dedication and discretion. The work was hard, but it allowed her to keep Ethan in a modest private school and save a little to fulfill her dream, opening a small bakery. As she prepared breakfast, Sarah smiled, thinking about the sweets she made on weekends. She had started by selling chocolate truffles to other employees in the community, and gradually her fame grew. Some residents had even ordered her sweets for children's parties, praising her natural talent for confectionery. "Mommy?" Ethan's sleepy voice brought her back to reality. "Can I go with you today?" Sarah hesitated. Normally, Ethan stayed at school during the day, but it was school vacation period, and the neighbor who usually looked after him was traveling. "Yes, you can, my love, but you have to promise to behave really well, okay?" The boy's face lit up. He loved going to work with his mother, especially because he could play in the community playground when there were no other children around. Sarah knew it wasn't ideal, but sometimes she had no choice. During the bus ride, Ethan couldn't stop talking about the superheroes from his favorite series. Sarah watched him lovingly, noticing how her son had inherited her outgoing personality. Yes, he was a bigger boy than other children his age, but that had never been a problem. He was healthy, intelligent, and above all had a huge heart. When they arrived at Oakwood Estates, they were greeted by Mr. Thompson, the doorman who always had a kind smile and some candy saved for Ethan. "Good morning, family. Ethan, what? A nice surprise to see you here." The boy ran to hug the doorman while Sarah signed the attendance book. The community was already beginning to wake up, with some residents leaving for work and others returning from their morning walks. Sarah started her routine in the common areas, always keeping Ethan close by. The boy proudly carried his backpack, with coloring books and some toys, content to sit quietly while his mother worked. During the morning, several people greeted Ethan warmly. Mrs. Johnson from apartment 502 even offered a piece of cake she had just made. The boy had this gift of winning people over with his sincere smile and fantastic stories. Close to lunchtime, Sarah was preparing to clean the pool area when she noticed a different movement. A group of executives was crossing the garden, talking in serious tones. Among them, she immediately recognized Richard Baldwin, the businessman who owned half of the apartments in the community. Something in the air changed. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, like a premonition. She called Ethan to come closer, but before she could reach him, the boy was already running towards a butterfly fluttering near the executives. "Ethan, come back here," she called, but her voice was muffled by the sound of the fountain. Time seemed to slow down as she watched her son inadvertently approaching the group. At that moment, Sarah couldn't imagine that this casual encounter would completely change the course of their lives. The midday sun shone intensely over Oakwood Estates, reflecting off the mirrored windows of the luxury apartments. Sarah quickened her pace towards her son, her heart accelerating for no apparent reason. That Monday, which had begun like so many others, was about to become the first chapter of a story that no one could have predicted. Ethan ran after the blue butterfly, his eyes shining with enchantment, oblivious to the tension that was beginning to form in the air. The group of executives stopped their discussion when the boy approached, some smiling discreetly at the innocence of the scene, all except Richard Baldwin. The businessman, known for his difficult temperament and intolerance for any kind of disturbance, observed the child with barely disguised contempt. Tall, impeccably dressed in his tailored Italian suit, he was the personification of power and arrogance. "Whose child is this?" he asked loudly, his cutting tone echoing through the common area of the community. Sarah, who was almost reaching Ethan, felt her heart tighten. "He's my son, sir," she replied, keeping her voice firm as she held Ethan's hand. "I'm sorry, he was just invading a private meeting," Richard interrupted her, his gaze running up and down the cleaner's uniform she wore. "And apparently bringing your child to work. This is completely inappropriate." The silence that followed was deafening. The other executives shifted uncomfortably, some consulting their cell phones as if looking for an excuse not to witness the scene. Ethan, sensing the change in the environment, clung to his mother's uniform skirt. "Mr. Baldwin, I apologize," Sarah tried again, her voice trembling slightly. "We're in the school vacation period, and is that my problem?" Richard cut her off again, his voice loaded with sarcasm. It was then that his eyes fell on Ethan, and a cruel smile formed on his lips. "Besides, look at him. Your baby is fat. Get him out of here. I don't want to see this child disturbing the peace of the community." The words hit Sarah like a slap. She felt Ethan's body stiffen beside her, and when she looked down, she saw tears forming in her son's eyes. The pain in her chest transformed into something different, a mixture of indignation and courage she had never felt before. "With all due respect, sir," she began, her voice surprisingly calm, "my son has a name. It's Ethan, and he's a healthy and well-behaved child. You have no right to speak about him like that." Richard Baldwin's face turned red. He wasn't used to being confronted, especially by an employee. "I have every right. I own half of these apartments and contribute significantly to your salary. I suggest you know your place." At that moment, Mrs. Johnson, who was passing through the common area, stopped when she noticed the discussion. The elegant grey-haired lady approached the group. "Richard, dear, don't you think you're being a bit harsh?" she intervened, her voice soft but firm. "Sarah is an excellent employee, and Ethan is a lovely child." The businessman shot an icy look at Mrs. Johnson. "Don't meddle in this, Margaret. You've always had this habit of defending lost causes." Sarah felt the blood boil in her veins. One thing was to attack her, but it was completely different to humiliate her son and be rude to Mrs. Johnson, who had always been so kind. "I'll take my son away, Mr. Baldwin," she said, raising her chin. "But know that your words don't reflect the greatness you think you have. They only show your pettiness." A murmur ran through the group of executives. Some hid smiles, others looked at Richard expectantly. The businessman took a step forward, his expression transformed by anger. "You just made a very serious mistake," he hissed. "Very serious indeed." Sarah held Ethan's hand tightly and walked away, feeling Richard Baldwin's furious gaze on her back. Her heart was racing, but something inside her had changed. The Sarah who always lowered her head and silently accepted injustices had been left behind on that Monday morning. Mrs. Johnson caught up with her when she was almost reaching the employee locker room. "Sarah, dear, are you all right? Don't let that man upset you. He's always been like this, but no one has ever had the courage to stand up to him." Sarah hugged Ethan, who was still trembling slightly. "I'm okay, Mrs. Johnson. But this won't end. Here, not this time." The lady smiled, a glimmer of admiration in her eyes. "You know, Sarah, sometimes it's the most unlikely people who end up changing things. Count on me for whatever you need." That afternoon, as she finished her shift with Ethan sleeping on the locker room couch, Sarah began to plan her next steps. She didn't know exactly how, but she was sure that this incident wouldn't be just another case of abuse of power ignored by everyone. It was time for someone to show Richard Baldwin that money and influence didn't give him the right to destroy people's dignity. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Oakwood Estates with a heavy but determined heart. Ethan had stayed with Sandra, a neighbor who offered to help after hearing about the incident. The boy was still shaken, having spent the previous night asking questions that broke Sarah's heart. "Mommy, why doesn't that man like me? Did I do something wrong?" As she entered the community, Sarah noticed that something was different. The employees were whispering among themselves, abruptly stopping when she approached. Mr. Thompson, the doorman, called her discreetly. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," he said, looking around. "Mr. Baldwin came by the administration office earlier. He was furious, demanding your immediate dismissal." Before Sarah could respond, Rebecca Taylor, the community manager, approached hurriedly. A middle-aged woman with heavy-framed glasses and an always worried expression, Rebecca was known for her diplomacy in difficult situations. "Sarah, can we talk in my office?" she asked, her tone revealing the tension of the moment. In the administration office, Rebecca closed the door and sighed deeply. "Sarah, I'm in a complicated situation. Mr. Baldwin is putting a lot of pressure. You know the influence he has here." "Mrs. Taylor, he publicly humiliated my son," Sarah replied, keeping her voice firm. "This isn't fair." I know. Rebecca nervously adjusted her glasses. "That's why I called some people who want to talk to you." At that moment, the door opened, and 3 people entered the room. Sarah immediately recognized Mrs. Johnson, who smiled kindly. Beside her was a tall, thin man who introduced himself as Michael Davis, a labor lawyer. The third person was a young woman with curly hair and a shrewd look, carrying a laptop. "I'm Emily Rodriguez, journalist from Truth Portal," she introduced herself. "Mrs. Johnson contacted me last night to tell me about what happened. Sarah, your story needs to be told." Michael Davis cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Mrs. Sarah, what happened here constitutes moral harassment and discrimination. We have witnesses to the incident. If you want, we can take legal action." Sarah looked at each of them, feeling a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. I don't know if I can afford to face a lawsuit." "Don't worry about that," Mrs. Johnson intervened. "Michael is my nephew and will handle your case pro bono. And as for you, Rebecca," she turned to the manager, "I suggest you think carefully before dismissing Sarah. That would only worsen the community's legal situation." Rebecca nodded, visibly relieved to have a justification for not giving in to Richard Baldwin's pressure. Emily, who was furiously typing on her laptop, looked up. "Sarah, there's something you need to know," the journalist said. "After Mrs. Johnson told me your story, I started investigating. Richard Baldwin has a history of abusive behaviors. Several people have suffered from his attitudes, but no one has had the courage to openly confront him until now." At that moment, another community employee knocked on the door. It was David, Richard Baldwin's personal assistant for 5 years. His face was pale and his hands were trembling slightly. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, closing the door behind him. "But I can't keep quiet anymore. There's a lot you need to know about Mr. Baldwin, a lot indeed." The silence that followed was charged with expectation. Emily quickly turned on her recorder, while Michael took out a notepad. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. That improvised meeting was about to reveal much more than she had imagined. "Before I start," David continued, his voice trembling, "you need to know that I have proof of everything I'm going to tell you. Documents, emails, recordings. I've kept everything over the last few years, knowing that one day someone would have the courage to stand up to him. Sarah, when I saw you defending your son yesterday, I knew that moment had come." Mrs. Johnson held Sarah's hand, giving her strength. The cleaner, who had always gone unnoticed through the corridors of Oakwood Estates, was about to become the center of a much bigger story than she could have imagined. A story that began with a mother's defense of her love for her son, but now promised to expose truths long hidden in the luxurious corridors of that community. In the administration office, the air was getting denser as David revealed years of irregularities and abuses committed by Richard Baldwin. Emily was typing frantically, her eyes shining with each new piece of information, while Michael was taking detailed notes. "He built an empire based on moral harassment and manipulation," David explained, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Employees are constantly humiliated, especially those he considers inferior. Sarah and Ethan's case is not isolated. There's more," he continued, opening his folder. "Here are emails where he explicitly orders not to hire people above a certain weight or who don't fit his aesthetic standards for customer service positions. There's even a blacklist of employees who dared to question his attitudes." Mrs. Johnson shook her head, indignant. "I always knew there was something wrong with how he treated people, but I never imagined it was so systematic." Emily looked up from her laptop. "David, you mentioned you have evidence about irregularities in his companies too. Can you elaborate?" Before David could answer, Rebecca, who was nervously watching through the window, interrupted. "He just arrived at the community." The group looked at each other tensely. "Don't worry," Michael intervened. "Legally, we're protected." "Sarah, you can't be fired now. It would be explicit retaliation." In the parking lot, Richard Baldwin was getting out of his latest Mercedes when his cell phone rang. It was his press officer, Amanda. "Mr. Baldwin, we have a problem," she said without beating around the bush. "A journalist from Truth Portal is asking questions about yesterday's incident. It's already getting repercussions on social media." The businessman felt his blood boil. "What do you mean, repercussions? I want this off the air immediately. Use our contacts. Do whatever it takes." "It's not that simple," Amanda replied. "The story is gaining strength because one of the community residents, Margaret Johnson, confirmed everything. And there are rumors that your personal assistant is collaborating with accusations." Richard paled. He looked at the administration office window and saw the gathered group. His gaze met Sarah's, and for the first time in his life, he felt something different from his usual contempt, fear. Meanwhile, in the office, Emily was showing on her laptop the comments that were already multiplying on social media. The video of the incident, recorded by one of the community employees, had leaked and was going viral. "People are outraged," Emily explained. "Several other victims of similar behaviors are starting to speak out. This is becoming much bigger than Oakwood Estates." Sarah watched everything with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "But what about my son? How do I protect Ethan from all this?" Mrs. Johnson smiled gently. "Dear, sometimes the best way to protect our children is to show them that we can fight against injustices. Ethan needs to see that his mother didn't bow down to bullying and discrimination." Michael, who was on the phone, hung up with a smile. "I just spoke with a colleague from the district attorney's office. They're interested in the case, especially after the revelations about systematic discrimination in the companies." Suddenly, the office door burst open violently. Richard Baldwin entered, his face contorted with rage. "What is this meeting? Rebecca, have you lost your mind? And you, David, are you traitor?" Before anyone could respond, Emily calmly stood up. "Mr. Baldwin, good thing you're here. I have some questions about your discriminatory hiring policies and cases of moral harassment in your companies. Would you like to comment?" The businessman took a step back, disconcerted. His gaze swept the room, resting on each face. They were no longer submissive and frightened people he saw. They were individuals determined to expose the truth. "This won't stand," he threatened, but his voice no longer carried the same authority as before. "You don't know who you're messing with." "On the contrary," Sarah replied, standing up. "For the first time, everyone is starting to know exactly who you are, Mr. Baldwin." The businessman left the room, slamming the door. In the hallway, his hands were shaking as he frantically typed on his cell phone, summoning his lawyers for an emergency meeting. The fortress of power and impunity he had built over the years was beginning to show its first cracks. In Sarah's small apartment, Ethan was playing with his toy cars while she prepared dinner, trying to keep the routine as normal as possible. It had been a week since the confrontation at the community, and the changes in their lives were evident. "Mommy, is Miss Emily coming over again today?" asked Ethan, looking up from his toys. In the past few days, the journalist had become a constant presence in their lives. Not just for work, but because she had developed a special fondness for the boy. "Not today, sweetheart. But Mrs. Johnson promised to stop by later to bring that chocolate cake you love," Sarah replied, smiling as she saw her son's eyes light up at the news. The phone rang. It was Michael, her lawyer. "Sarah, we have important news. The repercussions of the case are forcing several companies to review their contracts with the Baldwin Group. The pressure is increasing." Meanwhile, in the main office of Baldwin Group, Richard was facing a tense meeting with his board of directors. Amanda, his press officer, was presenting the alarming numbers. "The company's stocks have fallen 15% since the story broke," she explained, projecting graphs on the screen. "Social media is in an uproar, and 3 major business partners have already signaled their intention to suspend contracts. "This is ridiculous," Richard exploded, pounding the table. "All because of a cleaning lady and her brat. I want all our resources focused on reversing this immediately." Frank Carter, the CFO and Richard's longtime friend, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Richard, maybe we should consider a different approach, a public retraction." "Retraction?" Richard interrupted him, incredulous. "Never. That woman will learn that you don't challenge someone like me with impunity." Back at Sarah's apartment, Mrs. Johnson arrived with the promised chocolate cake. While Ethan savored his slice in the living room, the 2 women talked in the small kitchen. "Sarah, you won't believe it," Mrs. Johnson commented, lowering her voice. 3 other residents of the community came to talk to me today. They all have stories about Richard's abusive behavior. They're willing to testify. It's amazing how a single action can awaken so much courage in people, Sarah reflected, serving coffee. "But I confess that sometimes I'm afraid. Ethan had nightmares some nights, and yesterday a child at school asked if he was the boy from the viral video." Mrs. Johnson held her hand affectionately. "It's natural to be afraid, dear, but look at what you've already achieved. It's no longer just about you and Ethan. It's about all the people who suffered in silence." Sarah's cell phone vibrated with a message from Emily. "Urgent. I just received information about systematic discriminatory practices in all Baldwin Group companies. Several former employees are willing to speak out. Can we meet tomorrow?" At that moment, Ethan came into the kitchen, his face smeared with chocolate. "Mommy, can I tell you something? Today at school the teacher said you're very brave. She said that sometimes we need to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Sarah felt her eyes well up. She hugged her son, feeling his little heart beating strongly against hers. "And what do you think about that, my love?" "I think you're a superhero," he replied simply, "like the ones I see on TV, but for real." Mrs. Johnson watched the scene, moved. "You know, Sarah, sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with the simplest gestures. One day your son will fully understand the significance of what's happening." On the other side of the city, Richard Baldwin entered his penthouse apartment, exhausted after a day of endless meetings. He turned on the TV only to be confronted with another report about the case. His photo appeared next to the headline, "Businessman accused of discrimination faces investor boycott." For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of loneliness. His friends no longer answered his calls. Invitations to social events had ceased, and even his own daughter, who was studying abroad, had sent a message expressing her disappointment in his behavior. The cell phone rang again. It was Frank. "Richard, we need to talk. The situation is worse than we thought. The board is calling an extraordinary meeting for tomorrow. They're considering your removal." The words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. His empire, built over decades, was being shaken by something he considered insignificant. For the first time, he began to realize that perhaps he had greatly underestimated the power of human dignity. The waiting room of the pediatric clinic was quiet that Thursday afternoon. Sarah held Ethan's hand as they waited for the results of the tests the doctor had ordered. In recent weeks, in addition to the emotional stress caused by the whole situation, the boy had been showing worrying symptoms: excessive fatigue, constant thirst, and mood swings. "Mrs. Sarah," called the nurse, "Dr. Angela can see you now." Inside the office, the pediatrician greeted them with a welcoming smile, but Sarah immediately noticed the concern in her eyes. Ethan sat in the chair, swinging his little legs distractedly as he leafed through a children's magazine. "Sarah, Ethan's test results have come back," Dr. Angela began, adjusting her glasses. "We've identified that he has type 1 diabetes. It's an autoimmune condition that requires special attention and care." The world seemed to spin around Sarah. Diabetes, but he's so young. "Unfortunately, type 1 diabetes can manifest at any age," explained the doctor. "The recent emotional stress may have contributed to accelerating the process, but it's not the cause. The important thing now is that we start the appropriate treatment." As the doctor explained about insulin, glucose measurement, and diet, Sarah felt her heart tighten. Ethan, sensing the tension, held her hand. "Is everything okay, Mommy? Are you sad?" "No, my love," she answered, forcing a smile. "Mommy's just thinking about how we're going to take even better care of you." Leaving the office, Sarah checked her cell phone. There were several unread messages. Emily wanted to confirm an important interview, Michael had news about the lawsuit, and Mrs. Johnson was asking about the result of the consultation. On the way home, Ethan fell asleep on the bus, exhausted, after the long afternoon of tests. Sarah watched her son fighting back tears. The treatment would be expensive, would require full-time dedication, and she couldn't help but wonder how she would balance all of this with the battle she was facing. At home, after putting Ethan to bed, Sarah finally let the tears fall. The phone rang. It was Mrs. Johnson. "Dear, how did it go at the doctor's?" Sarah broke down, telling her everything between sobs. On the other end of the line, Mrs. Johnson listened attentively. "Sarah, listen carefully," she said after a moment of silence. "You're not alone in this. Tomorrow I'm going to talk to my other nephew. He's an endocrinologist. And as for the treatment costs, don't worry. We can organize a fundraiser among the community residents." "Mrs. Johnson, I can't accept—" "Yes, you can," she interrupted firmly. "You've inspired a lot of people here, Sarah. Let people give back a little of the good you're doing." That same night, Emily showed up at Sarah's apartment after hearing the news. She brought food and, more importantly, valuable information. "Sarah, I discovered something you need to know," said the journalist, lowering her voice so as not to wake Ethan. "The Baldwin Group has a medical assistance program for outsourced employees that was never properly implemented. The money allocated for it was diverted for other purposes." "What do you mean?" "Carlos passed me documents proving that the program exists on paper, but in practice, Richard Baldwin personally blocked several requests for medical assistance in recent years, including from an employee who needed treatment for her child with a chronic condition." Sarah felt a chill. It was another layer of cruelty being revealed. "But there's more," Emily continued. "His daughter, Olivia, is returning from abroad specifically because of this scandal. From what I've gathered, she's completely different from her father. She works with social causes and was horrified by everything that's happening." Sarah's cell phone vibrated with a message from Michael. "Important meeting tomorrow. The district attorney's office wants to use the case of the medical assistance program as part of the lawsuit. We need to talk urgently." Looking at the room where Ethan was sleeping, Sarah felt a new wave of determination. Now she wasn't just fighting against discrimination and abuse of power. She was fighting for her son's health and future, and for so many other children who could have been helped if the medical assistance program had worked as it should have. "Emily," she said, wiping away her tears, "I think it's time to tell the whole truth. Not just about what happened to Ethan, but about everything. People need to know how Richard Baldwin really treats those who need help the most." O'Hare International Airport in Chicago was bustling when Olivia Baldwin disembarked from her flight from London. At 28, she carried not only her luggage, but also the weight of a surname that was now at the center of a media storm. Unlike her father, Olivia had chosen a completely different path. She worked with social projects and was known in the UK for her activism in humanitarian causes. "Miss Baldwin," a familiar voice called out. It was Amanda, her father's press officer, visibly nervous. "Your father asked me to pick you up." "That's not necessary, Amanda," Olivia replied curtly. "I called for a car. I'm going straight to his apartment." In the luxurious penthouse apartment, Richard Baldwin paced back and forth, obsessively checking his watch. His daughter's arrival made him anxious. Olivia was the only person capable of making him feel truly vulnerable. When the doorbell rang, he hesitated before opening the door. Olivia entered, her green eyes, just like her mother's, fixed on her father. "How could you?" were her first words. "A 6-year-old boy, Dad? Really?" "Liv, you don't understand. The situation is distorted by the media." "Distorted," she interrupted him. "I saw the video. I saw how you spoke to that child, to his mother. It's exactly the kind of behavior I've always criticized, and you know that." On the other side of the city, Sarah was at the hospital with Ethan learning about the diabetes treatment procedures when she received an unexpected message from Emily. Olivia Baldwin wants to meet you. Says she has important information and wants to help. What do you think? Sarah looked at Ethan, who was being taught by the nurse how to use the glucose meter. Her son was smiling, always optimistic, even in the face of challenges. I accept, Sarah replied, but on one condition. I want the meeting to be at the playground where it all started. The next morning, the playground at Oakwood Estates witnessed an unlikely encounter. Olivia arrived first, dressed simply, very different from her father's. Characteristic ostentation. Sarah arrived next with Ethan. Hi, Ethan. Olivia knelt down to be at the boy's height. Did you know that when I was your age, I also loved playing in this playground? The boy smiled shyly, looking at his mother for approval. Sarah nodded and Ethan ran to the swings. Sarah, Olivia began, her voice choked. First, I want to apologize for my father's behavior, but I didn't come here just for that. I came because I discovered something that could change everything. She opened her bag and took out a folder. I found these documents in the safe in his office. They're records of a medical assistance program that he sabotaged for years. But there's more. I discovered that my mother, before she left, had left a letter. In it, she talks about how his behavior towards people he considered different made her distance herself. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked. Because I understood that the problem is much bigger than an isolated incident. My father built an empire by hurting people, and I can no longer remain silent. At that moment, Ethan came running back. Mommy, I'm thirsty. Sarah immediately took the glucose meter from her bag. Olivia watched the procedure attentively. He has diabetes, she asked softly. We found out recently, Sarah replied, helping Ethan with the special juice she now always carried. Olivia closed her eyes for a moment, as if making a difficult decision. Sarah, there's something you don't know. The medical assistance program that my father blocked. It was my mother's project. She created it thinking of employees with children who needed special treatments. After she left, my father buried the project. Why? Sarah asked, holding Ethan close. Because for him, showing compassion is showing weakness, Olivia replied, her voice laden with sadness. But that's going to change. Tomorrow I have a meeting with the company board. I'm going to present all the documents and demand not only the reactivation of the program, but a complete restructuring of the employee assistance policy. Ethan, oblivious to the seriousness of the conversation, was playing with a toy car that Olivia had brought as a gift. You know, Sarah, Olivia continued, watching the boy, sometimes we need a mirror to see our own monsters. Ethan and you did that. You showed everyone, including me, that we can no longer accept this kind of behavior. From the top of the building, through his apartment window, Richard Baldwin observed the scene. His daughter, his only weak point, talking to the woman who was destroying everything he had built. For the first time in his life, he felt not just fear, but shame. The shame of realizing that his own blood was turning against everything he represented. The boardroom of Baldwin Group had never seemed so suffocating. The board members, usually so confident in their expensive suits and studied poses, were shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. Olivia was standing, projecting documents and emails onto the giant screen that occupied one of the walls. As you can see, she continued her presentation, her voice firm and determined, the medical assistance program created by my mother not only existed on paper, but had approved and allocated funds. The question is, where did this money go over the last 5 years? Richard Baldwin, seated at the head of the table, maintained an impassive expression, but his hands were trembling slightly under the table. Frank Carter, the CFO, nervously cleared his throat. Olivia, dear, these documents are old and... Don't call me dear, Frank, she cut him off. And these documents may be old, but the bank statements showing the transfers are quite recent. Transfers that, curiously, ended up in personal accounts. On the other side of the city, Sarah was at the hospital with Ethan, in another session adapting to the diabetes treatment. Emily, who had become a constant presence in their lives, was with them. The board meeting started an hour ago, Emily commented, checking her cell phone. I have sources inside. They say Olivia is demolishing years of mismanagement and unethical behavior. Ethan, who was coloring a book while waiting his turn to be seen, looked up. Mommy, is Olivia going to come back to play with me again? Sarah smiled, stroking her son's hair. The meeting at the playground had left a deep impression on the boy. Olivia, unlike her father, had the gift of making people feel special. Back in the boardroom, the temperature was rising. Olivia was now presenting video testimonies from former employees, all reporting cases of discrimination and moral harassment. And it doesn't stop there, she continued. I have here the letter my mother left before she departed, a letter that my father hid from me for years, but which explains exactly why she decided to distance herself. Richard stood up abruptly. Enough, you have no right. I have every right, Olivia responded, her voice trembling with emotion. When I saw that video of you humiliating an innocent child, I finally understood why Mom couldn't take it anymore. You transformed our company, which should generate jobs and dignity, into a machine for destroying people's self-esteem. The board members exchanged tense looks. Amanda, the press officer, had tears in her eyes as she frantically took notes. As board members, Olivia continued, you have a choice to make today. You can continue to condone this system of abuses, or you can do the right thing. I'm proposing a complete restructuring, starting with the immediate reactivation of the medical assistance program. Mrs. Johnson, who had been invited to the meeting as a representative of the community residents, stood up to speak. If I may, I'd like to share something. I knew Olivia's mother, Claire, many years ago. She had a dream of transforming Baldwin Group into an example of social responsibility. The medical assistance program was just the beginning. Richard. Baldwin, for the first time, seemed to shrink in his chair. The mention of his ex-wife's name hit him like a physical blow. The board will deliberate, announced the chairman. I ask that everyone except the board members leave the room. In the hallway, Olivia was receiving messages of support from employees at all levels of the company. News of her presentation was already circulating through the corridors, bringing hope to many who had suffered in silence for years. Emily, who had just arrived at the company building, found Olivia in the lobby. How did it go? Asked the journalist. I did my part, Olivia replied, exhausted but determined. Now it's up to them. But there's one thing I still need to do today. Visit Ethan at the hospital. I promised to bring him a new book. The two women smiled at each other, aware that regardless of the board's decision, something fundamental had changed. The truth, once revealed, had the power to destroy walls that seemed insurmountable. At the hospital, Ethan was proudly showing the nurse how he already knew how to measure his glucose by himself. Sarah watched her son, amazed at his ability to find joy even in the most challenging moments. Her cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Olivia. On my way. I have important news and a new superhero for Ethan. The board's decision came like a tsunami, sweeping away years of questionable practices and establishing a new paradigm at Baldwin Group. In a historic vote, the board members not only approved the reactivation of the medical assistance program, but also determined Richard Baldwin's temporary removal from the presidency. Olivia was appointed interim director, with the mission of implementing a comprehensive reform of company policies. At the hospital, Sarah received the news through Olivia, who had kept her promise to visit Ethan. The boy was engrossed with his new superhero action figure, while the two women talked in hushed tones. The board wants you to be the first beneficiary of the reactivated program, Olivia explained, her eyes shining with emotion. All of Ethan's treatment will be covered, retroactively included, and that's not all. They want to create an ethics and inclusion committee, and they'd like you to be part of it. Sarah blinked, stunned by the proposal. Me? But I'm just a woman who had the courage to face an entire system of oppression. Olivia gently interrupted. Your example inspired dozens of other people to speak out. You're not just an employee, Sarah. You're a symbol of change. At Oakwood Estates, news of Richard Baldwin's removal spread like wildfire among the residents. Mrs. Johnson had organized a small gathering in her apartment, where employees and residents met to discuss the changes that were coming. "It's as if a weight has been lifted from our shoulders," commented Mr. Thompson, the doorman, who now spoke openly about years of silenced humiliations. "For the first time, I feel like we can work with dignity." David, Richard's former assistant, was also present. His expression was a mixture of relief and apprehension. "You know, working so many years by his side made me realize how power can corrupt, but I also learned that it's never too late to do the right thing." Emily, who was closely following everything for her report, realized she was witnessing something bigger than a simple exposé story. It was a case of social transformation, of how small acts of courage could trigger profound changes. In the Baldwin Group office, Olivia found herself immersed in work. Amanda, who had decided to stay with the company, was helping to organize a series of meetings with employees from all hierarchical levels. "It's amazing how people are feeling comfortable speaking up now," Amanda commented, organizing the dozens of emails they were receiving with suggestions and reports. "It's as if we've opened the windows of a house that's been closed for years." Meanwhile, in his penthouse apartment, Richard Baldwin was facing his own process of transformation. Alone for the first time in decades, he found himself forced to confront the consequences of his actions. On the coffee table, the letter from his ex-wife, which Olivia had left for him, waited to be read. With trembling hands, he finally opened the yellowed envelope. "Richard, when we met, you were a man full of dreams and compassion. At some point along the way, you let power and money turn your heart to stone. Today, seeing how you treat people you consider inferior, I no longer recognize that young man I fell in love with. Our daughter deserves a better example. I hope that one day you find your way back to your humanity. With love, Claire." At the hospital, Ethan was showing Olivia how he already knew how to calculate the right amount of insulin he needed. His contagious smile lit up the room. "Aunt Olivia, look," the nurse said, "I'm the bravest patient she's ever seen." Olivia smiled, feeling tears form in her eyes. "You really are very brave, Ethan. Did you know that you taught an important lesson to a lot of people, including my father?" Sarah, observing the interaction between the two, realized how life had mysterious ways of connecting people. Who could have imagined that her son, the target of cruel discrimination, would end up being the catalyst for such a profound transformation? Night was falling over Chicago, and with it a new era was dawning at Baldwin Group. Olivia, before leaving the hospital, hugged Sarah for a long time. "Tomorrow we start implementing all the changes," she said. "And you know what the first one will be? We're going to transform that playground where it all began into a truly inclusive space, with equipment adapted for all children." Ethan, who was listening attentively, looked up from his new action figure. "So everyone will be able to play together?" "Exactly, sweetheart," Olivia replied, ruffling his hair, "because that's how the world should be. A place where everyone has space to be who they are." 6 months had passed since that fateful afternoon at the Oakwood Estates playground. The place, once the scene of discrimination, was now completely transformed. Adapted swings, access ramps, and inclusive play equipment made the space welcoming for all children. It was a sunny Saturday, and the playground was full of life. Ethan, now fully adapted to his diabetes treatment, was playing animatedly with other children. His glucose meter, decorated with superhero stickers, had become a source of curiosity and learning among his new friends. Sarah observed the scene from the common area, where she was organizing the final details of her newest venture, an inclusive cafe within the community. The idea, proposed by her during one of the ethics committee meetings, had been enthusiastically embraced by Olivia and the new board. "Who would have thought, huh?" commented Mrs. Johnson, approaching with a tray of chocolate truffles, Sarah's special recipe, adapted for diabetics. From cleaner to entrepreneur and member of the Baldwin Group Ethics Committee. Sarah smiled, adjusting the apron with the logo of her new business. Sweet dreams, flavor for all. The cafe would be officially inaugurated that afternoon, and nervousness mixed with a deep sense of accomplishment. Emily, who continued to follow the story, was now preparing a book about the transformation of Baldwin Group and its impact on the discussion of corporate social responsibility. "You know what's most impressive?" she commented, making notes on her laptop. "The domino effect this has caused. Other companies are reviewing their policies after what happened here." On the other side of the playground, Olivia was talking with a group of parents. The medical assistance program, now fully active, was already benefiting dozens of families. But her greatest achievement had been the change in culture within the company. "Daddy?" Ethan's voice caught everyone's attention. Richard Baldwin was standing at the entrance to the playground, visibly nervous. It was the first time he had appeared in public since his removal. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the boy's footsteps, who approached the businessman without hesitation. "Do you want to try my special chocolate truffle? Mommy made them for people who can't eat too much sugar like me." Richard looked at the treat offered by the same child he had humiliated months ago. His hands were shaking when he accepted the truffle. "Thank you, Ethan," he said, his voice choked. It's delicious." Olivia approached her father, placing her hand on his shoulder. The months of intensive therapy and reflection had left visible marks on Richard. He was thinner, more humble, more human. "Sarah," he called, turning to her. I came to apologize. Not just for what I did to Ethan, but for all the years of arrogance and cruelty. I know words aren't enough, but I'm trying to change." Sarah observed the man in front of her, so different from that arrogant businessman who had humiliated her. "The important thing is that we're all learning and growing," she responded with serenity. The afternoon progressed, and the cafe filled with residents and employees. David, now human resources manager at Baldwin Group, was coordinating a professional training project for outsourced employees. Mr. Thompson, the doorman, had been promoted to security supervisor, implementing a training program focused on respect and dignity. "Mommy, tell that story again," Ethan asked, sitting down with a group of children. "The story of how you became a superhero." Sarah laughed, pulling her son into a hug. "I'm not a superhero, my love. Just a person who learned that sometimes we need to fight for what's right, even when it seems impossible." "But you changed everything," insisted one of the children. "Now everyone can play together, and nobody gets sad." Olivia, who was listening to the conversation, added, "You know what the real lesson of this story is? That each of us has the power to make a difference. Sometimes it just takes one person having the courage to say no for others to find the strength to do the same." Richard Baldwin, sitting in a more secluded corner, observed everything with misty eyes. The empire he had built at the cost of arrogance and discrimination was transforming into something much more valuable, a space of inclusion and respect. The sun was beginning to set when Ethan gathered all the children for a photo in front of the new cafe. Sarah, Olivia, Mrs. Johnson, Emily, and surprisingly even Richard were called to participate. At the moment, the flash went off. It captured more than smiles. It registered the beginning of a new era, where differences were no longer a reason for separation, but for celebration. "Sometimes," Sarah whispered to Ethan as they returned home that night, "the greatest gifts come disguised as challenges, and you, my son, were the greatest gift this community could have received." Ethan smiled, squeezing his mother's hand. In the sky, the first star of the night shone, a silent witness to how a mother's love and a child's innocence were capable of transforming not just a community, but the hearts of all the people who lived there.